Jared, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, members of the committee, for allowing me to speak tonight. My name is Jared Muffet. I'm with the Marijuana Policy Project, not the Cannabis Policy Project, unfortunately. I'm here to speak in general support of the Governor's budget proposal to legalize, regulate, and tax marijuana. And then I also want to raise a pretty big concern that I have, though. So while generally supportive, I want to talk about a subject that I think has been only touched on briefly this evening. So let me just first start from the position of a big picture. Why is legalization a good idea? Why should Rhode Island move forward with this? I think that, in order for you guys to feel motivated to think about the details of how all this works, I think there needs to be a feeling of this is the right direction to move in. And so I'll just share, why I became an advocate for marijuana policy reform was because I initially learned to see it as a social justice issue. And I think a lot of people at this point share the belief that we shouldn't be using law enforcement resources to arrest people, put them in prison, ruin their lives in many different ways for marijuana. I think as a society that's responsible for the massive shift in opinion that we've seen. We know that with a criminal record, there's all sorts of punishments that come from that. Even if you don't even spend time in prison, makes it harder to get a job. It can become harder to get a student loan, harder to find housing. And so we have thousands of fellow Rhode Islanders who have experienced the harms of prohibition. And of course, in the whole country, we make around 600,000 to 700,000 marijuana arrests every year. And so that's how I initially was introduced to this subject and became passionate about changing it, because it made no sense. It seemed to me that in a country that values freedom and fairness, that the government should have a very high standard for taking away that liberty from people. And as I learned more about it, I became even more outraged, because I learned that not only were we locking people away for this, but we were doing it in a racially disproportionate way and an income disproportionate way. So that, in other words, the most vulnerable people in society were being arrested and treated differently under these laws than many other people. And so that discrepancy, we know now that in Rhode Island, the arrest rate is about 3 times higher for Black Rhode Islanders compared to whites from the years of 2000 to 2010. So that compounds the unfairness and immorality of the policy of prohibition. Now, let me bring it back to where we are today. This body, the General Assembly, Rhode Island passed a measure to decriminalize the possession of marijuana. In 2012, it went into effect in 2013. I would suggest to you that in that process, what was happening is we were, as a society and as a state, recognizing the failure of prohibition. I think that in decriminalizing possession, there was a recognition that someone should not have their life ruined for a minor possession offense. But look at where we are now. We've decriminalized possession, but we haven't decriminalized sales. We haven't created a legal avenue for a consumer to actually make that purchase. We haven't legalized the production of it. So we've essentially made a half measure. Even though it's a measure in the right direction, we certainly shouldn't be giving people criminal records for possession, but we haven't quite finished the job. And so I would suggest to you that the reason you should move forward with, in general, a policy of legalization is because we're in a limbo right now. We've said that we shouldn't be criminalizing this possession, but we're going to leave the rest of it unseen, out of sight. And I think that you've heard for many good reasons why that's an unfortunate or irrational policy, because in doing so, we've just created an illicit market that we have no control over. You've heard testimony from many people about how with regulation, we're going to be able to better protect public health and safety. It makes no sense. If we're going to tolerate possession, which we've acknowledged through decriminalization, we also need to then create rules and regulations over the marketplace so that it isn't putting people in danger, so that it isn't producing revenue for illegal actors. And of course, there are benefits when you bring it above ground too, tax revenue and legitimate job creation. So that's why I think we need to move forward, is because we're in this limbo where we've acknowledged that prohibition has failed, but we haven't completed the process of actually doing what it takes to create a more rational program. So the other thing to keep in mind is that 10 other states have adopted laws to legalize marijuana. So Rhode Island is not alone in this. This is the direction the country's moving in. We know we've heard about Connecticut moving forward, but New Jersey is also on the verge of passing a legalization bill. New York, New Hampshire might actually pass a bill this year as well. So all throughout the Northeast, there is a definite trend towards legalization. So I do agree with the governor's logic that if Rhode Island makes itself an island of prohibition, all we're doing is denying ourselves the ability to create revenue, but also the ability to bring economic opportunity to the state. And so if this is going to be something that's existing around us, it seems senseless to not allow some of those benefits to accrue to Rhode Island. So that's in general why I think the committee should support moving forward with this proposal. That said, I did mention that I have a pretty big concern. This was raised by Steve Brown from the ACLU briefly. I want to focus a little bit more on it. As I mentioned, the way that I sort of view this issue is through a criminal justice, social justice type of lens, and looking at the thousands of lives in this state alone that have been harmed as a result of our criminalization of marijuana. I think that in moving forward with legalization, we have an opportunity not only to create a more sensible policy, but also to attempt to remedy some of the harms that have been done. And so one of the things that I think a lot of advocates like myself have noted is that as legalization has occurred in other states, there haven't been many steps to ensure that the people who were hurt most under prohibition are able to benefit under legalization. And there's an obvious unfairness there, right? If Black Rhode Islanders are being arrested at 3 times the rate, or were arrested at 3 times the rate under prohibition, and then we don't create ways that ensure that they are that we remedy that or even address that historical injustice, then I think we've missed an opportunity to sort of atone for that and to sort of acknowledge the harms that have been created. So I think it's important to keep that general idea in mind, and unfortunately, the governor's proposal does, I think, lack some things that could improve the bill along those lines. So I'll just list a few things that I think should be considered as amendments that would address the historical harm that's been created by prohibition and the war on drugs in general. So number one, I think that we often talk about expungement and allowing people to retroactively clear their records after something becomes decriminalized or legal, and that would occur for possession and things that would be legal under this legislation. However, again, what we've been doing now under the current policy, we also criminalize low-level sales. We criminalize cultivation, and so there are people who I think have committed those offenses under a prohibitionist system that we know is unequally applied. I believe that expungement opportunity and the clearing of those records need to be expanded to include folks with low-level sales offenses and low-level cultivation offenses as well, so not just possession, because there's a lot of folks who have been harmed by those arrests as well. And so this is an opportunity to create a blank slate. And if you commit a marijuana offense while legalization or after legalization has been adopted, that's a different story. But we have a chance to look back at a historically unjust policy and make some amends for that. The second thing is, in California, their law includes what's called the Social Reinvestment Fund. And what they do is they simply set aside some of the tax revenue from marijuana sales, from marijuana revenue, and they set it aside for community nonprofits and programs that benefit communities that were most disproportionately harmed under prohibition. And they figure that out by looking at arrest rates and comparing it to the state average. And I think that's a sensible idea too. Whether or not it's linked to marijuana revenue specifically or not, I do think it's worth, again, saying we had this policy in place for decades that disproportionately harmed communities of color, low-income people. Now that we have this new revenue, let's set aside at least some of it to invest in things like reintegrating formerly incarcerated people, perhaps for job training, perhaps for education, something that acknowledges that we need to reinvest in those communities that were hurt the most. Number three, I think that there's a really good argument to make some type of social equity program similar to what Massachusetts have. So they are able to designate certain applicants for marijuana licenses as social equity applicants. And essentially what that does is opens up certain types of fast tracking. It opens up an ability to receive technical assistance and mentors with the application process. And all that really does is it encourages people, again, from the from disadvantaged communities communities to be part of this new industry that legalization would be creating. And again, there's going to be a lot of money to be made, and again, that's good for a lot of reasons, but I think that we can't repeat the disproportionate impact and leave people out once we have legalization. I think it's important to make sure that we do our best to include everyone in the wealth that's generated by this. And so a social equity program, Representative Ranglin Vassell in the House has introduced legislation that would create a social equity program in the medical program, and that would extend into legalization, and I think that's definitely a great place to look. And then the last thing is, I think that regulators should be asked to make diversity and inclusion and lowering barriers to entry to make sure that folks have an opportunity, even if you don't have a ton of money, to get into the market. And this does go back to a conversation that was discussed earlier about undue influence and control of some actors within the program. We know that the medical program is it has a bottleneck with the 3 dispensaries. So I think it's important to have language that asks the regulators and makes it an objective that can be accounted for to keep access open to everyone and to make it fair, to make it competitive for the free market reasons that you mentioned, and also so that everyone has a chance to share in some of the prosperity that's created by this. I have a lot of other thoughts, but you've heard a lot of them tonight, and I don't have too much more, I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for your presentation. Any questions or comments for this witness? Senator Ashenwald.
Just a quick comment. I always appreciate your testimony. You're exceptionally bright. You do a lot of research. You advocate passionately, and I think you bring a lot to the table and should always be included in the dialogue. I always look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it.
Senator DePalma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jared, thank you for being here. We are clearly have been opposite sides of the issue. I think we'll remain on opposite sides of the issue, but you clearly have been associated with this from the beginning. I will say you should be commended for that. Not because of the issue, but your effort in doing that. But no, you clearly have been, and I'll also say I've definitely seen you mature over the years you've been doing this. And well
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you for your testimony.